Okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is Richard Reeser, General Secretary of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, and numbers are going up quite quickly, so I'm sure there's going to be more of us on this call. At the moment, my co-presenter, Dr. Sruti Mohapatra from India, we seem to have lost, so I hope she'll join us later. With me also is Sarah Kamau from Kenya, our acting chair. And on video later on, you will see Michael Njenga, who's our CDPF exec member covering mental health. We'll be showing some other film extracts. I've been told by a number of people that I need to slow down, and I give notice now that we will, from modules 5 and 6, we'll be simplifying the slides. So there will be there'll be the slide presentation, which will be much fewer words, but there'll also be a script for the detail of what the presenters are saying, which you'll get from the text of it. And they'll be using a script to say more. So we hope that will simplify things a lot more. Today's module is on health. I hope you managed to look at the presentation. We'll be running over a number of the points that we made in that presentation because we had to go quite quickly through it. And we're going to focus particularly on, as you would expect, COVID-19 and the impact of that. But particularly the health side of it, but toward the end, the impact generally on disabled people, and Article 12 mental health issues, as well as looking at Article 25 on health itself. So that's what we aim to cover today. And so I'd like to hand over now to our acting chair, Sarah, to start the introduction. Sarah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Kamau from Kenya. As you've heard, I'm the acting chair for CDPF at the moment. And I want to welcome you to this module today at this seminar on health and COVID-19 and health and how it impacts on persons with disabilities. So I'll start by saying that looking back, we had come to expect the slow but steady progress of the conversion of persons with disabilities, and especially the new framing on disability that it exemplifies. How wrong we were. Basic truths have a habit of coming to the surface during crisis. So it was with the COVID pandemic. Basic services were swept away. Preventive measures were not adequately communicated. Food, nutrition, healthcare services were rationed. Institutions became even more obviously dangerous places to be. Home became an incredible, dangerous place for women and girls with disabilities. As the Disability Rights Monitor report of October 2020 has vividly shown, the old framing of persons with disabilities as objects and not as subjects came to the surface during the crisis, and we have been trying to put it on one side ever since. Disabled people experience shown from the summit and the surveys carried by CDPF wrote to government in June. One of the things that was discovered, or the findings, is that disabled people's organizations are not generally being consulted by governments, with a few exceptions like Malaysia and Guyana. And there was lack of information access has been addressed in most countries. Stigma is still an issue. There's some background noise somewhere.
Could everyone who's not presenting mute their microphone, please? We're getting feedback because someone's got their microphone open. Thank you.
So I've done that, sorry.
Okay, I'll continue that. Lack of support for personal assistance, food, welfare, medicine, unusual medicine procedures. There was also unemployment and lack of reasonable accommodation, especially for self-employed. Lack of access to online schooling and erosion of support for disabled students. There were higher fatality rates for disabled institutions, people with learning difficulties, and those with chronic conditions who need shielding support from government. Any of these issues got worse in second and third wave of the pandemic. The Disability Rights Monitor report also found the egregious failure to protect the lives of people in residential institutions who have become hotspots for pandemics. Instead of prioritizing emergency measures to reintegrate people into the community, respondents pointed out that many institutions have been locked down with fatal consequences. There was also widespread rigid shutdown that caused a dramatic breakdown in essential services in the community. People could not access basic goods, including food and support, such as personal assistance. Strict enforcement of these lockdowns by police and security forces has sometimes had tragic results. Serious and multiple human rights violations against underrepresented populations of disabled people, women and girls have experienced a major uptick on violence. Disabled children have been denied access to online education, and homeless disabled people have either been rounded up, detained, or left completely to fend for themselves. A concerning trend of denying basic and emergency healthcare, including worrying reports about the adoption of discriminatory triage procedures. In some cases, persons with disabilities were directly denied access to treatment for COVID-19 because of their impairments. I'll talk about Article 12 and rights of people with mental issues.
You skipped one, I think.
Okay.
It's one on health.
Okay, health issues. With regards to the rights of disabled people with mental health issues, their rights are widely ignored, and many Commonwealth countries have laws that directly contradict the rights contained in Article 12 of UNCRPD. The CRPD committee observes in most of the state party reports that the committee has examined so far, the concepts of mental and legal capacity have been conflated so that where a person is considered to have impaired decision-making skills, often because of a cognitive or psychosocial disability, his or her legal capacity to make a particular decision is consequently removed. This approach is flawed for two key reasons. One, discriminatorily applied to people with disabilities, and two, it presumes to be able to accurately assess the inner workings of the human mind, and when the person does not pass the assessment, it denies him or her a core human right. The right to equal recognition before the law, Article 12 does not permit such discriminatory denial of legal capacity, but rather requires support to be provided in the exercise of legal capacity. You will get the details in the link that you have, and I will talk about the language that CDPF uses to conceptualize why we call ourselves, for example, one concept is disabled people, why we still choose to call ourselves disabled people in the Commonwealth Disabled People Forum. We call ourselves disabled people because of the development of the social model of disability. In the 19th and 20th century, a disabled person medical condition was thought to be the root cause of their exclusion from society, an approach now referred to as medical or individual model of disability. We use the social model of disability where the barrier of environment, attitude, and organization are what disable people with impairments and lead to prejudice and discrimination. So to call ourselves persons with disabilities, to accept that we are objects and powerless. We also view ourselves as united by a common oppression, so are proud to identify as disabled people rather than people with disabilities. When we are talking about the UNCRPD, we will use persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, now I thought I looked around for a film on COVID, and the best one that we could find was from ESCAP. ESCAP is the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, and they themselves calculate in Asia Pacific region, which includes China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and all of the Pacific countries. There are 690 million disabled people. So we thought this film was actually quite a good one.
Colleagues, for the short video.
690 million persons with disabilities in Asia Pacific, already excluded before COVID-19. The disability community faces new normals. COVID-19 is our new reality.
I can't afford to get infected. COVID-19 infection means certain death for me.
No money, no food, no medicine, no soap. Everything stopped. What if my parents die?
This lockdown has been so difficult for Naeem, who has autism. He has broken his iPad and his keyboard just because of this.
COVID-19 information for the public is not always made accessible to persons with disabilities, especially those of us who rely on the use of computer screen reading software.
Persons with psychosocial disabilities who are institutionalized are at much greater risk. They have access to a very few amount of information.
All health systems are stretched. Tough call. Who to save and who to let down.
We have crippling expenses and empty coffers. It is now so difficult to raise funds. Adapt to thrive.
In Bangladesh, CDD and many other organizations of persons with disabilities distribute relief packages, create awareness and promote teletherapy in community for our fellow persons with disabilities. But the good thing is that we have a long-term partnership with the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, and they have issued this directive to all district commissioners to implement disability inclusive COVID-19 responses.
Okay, so
We use Filipino Sign Language. When COVID-19 started, the media did not have sign language interpretation. We deaf persons broke information barriers. Now we have sign language interpretation for the news. We relay medical consultations and information with easy-to-understand infographics. We hope to partner with our government and experts for sustainable, accessible sign language communication systems.
In the new reality, we must adapt to new normals.
Every life matters. We are 690 million. We are forced.
Colleagues, for the short video.
So I think a mixed picture there from Asia and Pacific, but I think covering a lot of angles. So that film is there and it will be up on the website and the presentations. I think people can go back and look at it and so on, but I think there was a lot in there. So really what we found from the coronavirus and how it has affected us is it's affected our health and well-being, care and support, the livelihoods, how we actually getting the wherewithal to survive, vulnerability to disease, or we would prefer to call it our risk to disease. I'll say a bit about the word vulnerable in a minute. Mental health has got worse, particularly for disabled people, for lots of people. We heard about the access to information has had a big impact on education and the increase in domestic violence. And as we said in the presentation, really this is reinforcing what we said there. I'm not going to read everything out, but those particularly affected have been, the World Health Organization yesterday said there was a direct link with obesity. Well, unfortunately, obesity is linked with some disabling conditions such as diabetes, such as heart conditions. So they equally could have said those conditions were more at risk, but also anyone with immune system difficulties, anyone with a lung function. We heard a man from Malaysia there who was on a ventilator as part of his normal life, is that if he got infected, it was a death sentence. And that, unfortunately, around the world, that has been too much what has happened to people. That also people who have learning difficulties, intellectual issues, there's been confusion. Also those who have dementia have not been able to understand sometimes what is required. And those with liver and heart conditions also been significantly impacted. Perhaps the biggest factor that came out in both the global report and also what we gathered was that those living in institutions or care homes, and by institutions I mean asylums, orphanages, disabled homes for people, mental health facilities, and older people who, particularly in the more higher income countries, because they have accumulated wealth over their lives, pay to be looked after in care homes. It's not a concept that we have in many parts of the Commonwealth, but it is certainly in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and I think South Africa and some parts, other parts where the wealthier pay to be looked after. We would argue that these people shouldn't have to be put in these institutions, that the Article 19 of the Convention on Independent Living means that all people should be supported in their community and have their own choice of where they live. And most people who go into care homes, some people choose it, but most people go because they cannot get the support they need for daily living. And it's been that group who have been hit hardest by fatalities, and has been a really serious situation. The next thing was many people reported from many different contexts that their access to goods and services, that they relied on people in the community or personal assistants, care workers. We prefer personal assistants, but also care workers and family, to get things for them, medicines, sanitary products, catheters, a whole range of things that they need, as well as food. This was disrupted, and even where there was money made available in a number of countries, India included, at the top level, people who were identified, and of course many people are not certified in these systems because the government doesn't identify in many of the more populous, poorer countries, or the less high income countries, the vast majority of disabled people. So people were not all getting this, but even those who were entitled to it didn't get that money. It didn't trickle down for many months. Particularly we heard in India, with the introduction of a lockdown and large numbers, millions and millions of people having to move back to their community, home, village, who'd been living in temporary accommodation in the cities because that's where they could make money through informal employment of various sorts. Suddenly all of that came to an end, and the impact on that is going to take many years for people to recover, because the people who are living in these marginal situations have really been affected. And so we see there that one Indian organization survey showed that 67% of people with disability interviewed had no access to doorstep deliveries. Only 20% got essentials. So this was has been a real issue, continues to be a real issue. Care, near lockdown, meant the care labourers did not get passes. There was a lack of transport. Many places just shut their gates, so you couldn't actually get the support that you needed. Another issue that was very influential here was personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, gowns, and so on became certainly in the first wave, but continued to be not available to large numbers of people. And many people couldn't wash because they didn't have the wash facilities to wash their hands regularly. And without the masks, the aerosol nature of the virus spreading, it did continue to spread. And that was in many situations, people couldn't keep to the social distance of 2 meters or 2 yards. Only 12% of unpaid carers feel they had enough support from social care, and 64% of carers were providing 50 or more hours a week. And this is from a Scope survey in the UK. We got similar stories from Australia and Canada and South Africa. And we also find that there was a big drop in well-being and health, so that 75% or 3/4 of people, again, this is a UK statistic, seems the UK Office of National Statistics gathered far more data than anywhere else. And it's partly because they have a record of who they think is disabled people, because they ask the question in the census, and so they can extrapolate from that. 75% were worried about the effects of coronavirus on their life. People with health conditions were twice as likely to feel lonely than the overall population, and 43% of the population with health conditions reported high levels of anxiety. And there are some other areas, well-being, access to groceries and health. You can see that the blue bar, which is well-being, 52% compared to 48% impact. Access to groceries, 25% for disabled people compared to 15% non-disabled, and health, 25% to 14%. Compared to data from October, disabled people experience similar impacts on their well-being and health, with a slightly increase in concern about the effects on their lives, which has gone up from 70% and anxiety to 40%. So we can see that where we have the statistics, it shows a real change. We have some statistics here from some middle and low income countries in the Commonwealth, Kenya and Bangladesh. And this is the impact on employment that shows that many respondents surveyed in Kenya and Bangladesh have faced employment and job insecurity. They were most concerned about their finances due to a lack of government benefits. Kenya, 68% of persons with disabilities reported not being able to work, while 65% felt insecure in their current jobs. In Bangladesh, 80% reported not being able to work, and more than 85% felt insecure. That was a survey from Leonard Cheshire. So we see that this insecurity and impact on jobs has been everywhere. In the high income countries, there was a subsidy from government called furlough, and that has sort of caused big economic problems. Yeah. Could we have muting, please? In India, most Commonwealth countries, disabled people work in unorganized sector. So we have a problem there. And according to surveys done by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, in May, that in the most frequently company practices, and this was big companies in India as well, Bangladesh, Pakistan, but the smaller companies did not do this, but the big multinationals did go for teleworking, flexible working, paid leave, and working from home. Whereas for most self-employed people, employment and therefore livelihood just ended overnight. Many of them do not officially come under the statistics and did not receive any financial assistance. So livelihoods have been very dramatically impacted. And I think we'll see towards the end of this presentation, when Antonio Guantaris speaks, that really the UN can identify that this COVID, in Building Back Better, we have a real crisis for disabled people as well as everybody else, but more especially for us in the world. And tackling these issues is going to be vital. Next, we go on to the specific UK figures that we used in the presentation, but I think it needs a little explanation really, because how do they get such finely graded figures? Which is where the figure that 60% of the deaths from the period from March to May, and they've done it now through to November, and they find the same sort of proportion, 60% of the deaths are disabled people, when they're only 17% of the population in England and Wales. And the reason is that they ask questions in the census, and so therefore they can track back, but the last census was 10 years ago. So you could add at least 9%. So it's probably nearer to 70% is actually the figure rather than 60. And that's questions which are asked, are you limited a lot in carrying out normal day-to-day activities, or limited a little, and then in a number of different ways. So that's how they get these statistics. And I think most countries don't have that database, so they can't do that. The impact on people's mental health has also been a big issue, and we'll be talking more about mental health a little later on, but behaviors such as distancing have impacted on people. We've also had people with mental health issues and psychological distress have impacted on both the higher risk groups, but also on the general population. So in a way, COVID has created, apart from the post-COVID infection syndrome, which has created new long-term impairments for some people, it has also created new psychological impairments for a whole group of people with high levels of anxiety that may not go away for some substantial time. And therefore, these people have developed a long-term impairment, which means that they become disabled people. Mass trauma is a real issue. We also have unique stressors that could worsen mental health of people who already have this condition. And research from past pandemics shows that disabled people find it harder to access critical medical supplies, which can become even more challenging. And that, for instance, is for people who are reliant on various medical interventions to control their state of mind. So it will impact on those people as well if they can't actually get their medication. We heard on the film a lot about communication helplines. There's a general lack of accessible information, no dedicated helplines, though many DPOs have been able to step forward. We heard from the one in Pakistan, in Bangladesh that did that, but we have many examples from India and Pakistan, in Africa, where people have set up these helplines to talk to people around the issues. So for instance, DPO in Odisha, daily COVID bulletin was supported by sign language interpreters, but another round of persistent advocacy finally saw that the lack of sign language was actually replaced. And there was a battle in lots of countries to get sign language when there were these briefings from ministers and prime ministers. Some were very good at doing it from the beginning, but many others, there had to be court battles even to actually get it. And it's not surprising that the World Health Organization finds that 61% of government websites are not accessible. So don't actually go by Article 21, which they need to be going by. And they're the signatories of the convention. So one would expect them to be doing it. And they're not. So we have to have that as an issue as well. The impact on education, this has been a really big impact. 1.6 billion children were out of school, some of them for as long as a year, and are still out in many places, or only just going back. In other places, people seem to have gone back. So for instance, the third lockdown in the UK, children will be going back to school next Monday. They've been off since before Christmas, and before that they had a month off, then they were back. And then they had 3 months off last year from March to June. In other places, it's just been a lockdown right the way through, and this has had a big impact on children, on their mental health, but also on particularly on disabled children who get, where they have extra support, they haven't been getting it, where they've been homeschooled, they've not been getting the sort of support that they want. The IT systems that they use at school, they often don't have at home. Many schools don't have IT systems. So there's a just a lack of expertise to use IT systems. Many people could get lessons on their iPhones, their mobile phones or radios. And that was in many countries, they did introduce education programs that were doing that. But still there was a problem of the number of devices. If there are 4, 5, 6 children in the family and there's only one device, who's going to be using it and when? And if the disabled child needs to take longer because of their impairments to actually access the learning, then they're likely to be left out. And this has been one of the big issues. And so much of the progress that we've made around the world on getting more children back into education is likely to impact on girls' education, and particularly like to impact on the inclusion of disabled young people. When curriculum material was produced by government or by television programs that put it out, it was often not differentiated. It sort of was aimed at a sort of midpoint in the class learning abilities, and therefore wasn't much use to people who needed particular adaptations, scaffolding and other such things. Lack of peer support was also an issue. And existing inequalities of income and social insecurity were multiplied. Poorer children, disabled children missed out on feeding programs. Many children around the world rely for their one substantial meal on the meal that they get at school, and they were not getting that. And therefore the likelihood of more stunting and less growth for children, poorer health, is very much on the cards. Staff absences and illnesses, because they were not immune to the infection, meant that there was nobody to teach those children who did get to school or needed remote learning. We've had a number of surveys in the UK that have shown that this has had a really negative impact on the learning of disabled children. And even though schools were meant to take children who had particular needs, we find that many parents didn't send their children to school. So the schools stayed open for those children. We've also seen a huge increase in violence to girls, 2 to 3, and women, 2 to 3 times the normal level of abuse, which is already 2 or 3 times higher. So that means that 83% of disabled women generally are sexually abused at some point in their life, but the level will have been higher because of domestic closeness, being at home with lockdown with people. This has been one of the things, and the flashpoint where very often male violence is directed at women. It's not always that way, but most of the time it goes one way. 77% of women and 80% of men reported an increase in economic, physical, psychological, or sexual violence after COVID. In Uganda, 1 in 3 women respondents reported experiencing an increase in physical or sexual violence. That's from ADD. Bangladesh, 39 DPO leaders said that their members are at a greater risk of gender-based violence because of COVID. 47% reported their members are at greater risk of violence at home or in the community. So it's pretty clear from surveys all around the world, and the global monitoring report that we mentioned towards the beginning had 25 testimonies of grave human rights abuses, including multiple forms of assault and violence. The impact of COVID on disabled people, there is Sisters for Freedom, which is a group of disabled women in the UK who were protesting around this not being taken seriously enough. Who was talked to? Well, it wasn't just, as the first slide showed, Malaysia and Guyana. We find that there was quite a lot of collaboration with DPOs in Bangladesh, Cameroon, Gambia, parts of India, Malaysia, Maldives, New Zealand, Scotland, and Singapore, and there may well have been more. We say Scotland because Scottish government is devolved and they have a much closer relationship with DPOs there. In England, the government doesn't really want to talk to the organisations of disabled people. It prefers to talk to the organisations for, something we talked about in Module 1. There is a difference between organisations run by disabled people and controlled by disabled people and those run for us, what we call the charities. Yes, they do good work, but they don't actually represent our voice. And we said that they need to be doing much more to build our voice rather than building up their profile. And we would continue to say that through this course. Okay, coming to the end of this overview of COVID. So some questions for the chat. So this is your chance to come in. First question, what was the worst impact of COVID on your life as a disabled person over this last year? And the second one, which you might want to put in the same chat, and what was the best response to COVID-19 in your country and why for disabled people? So I'll read those again. What was the worst impact of COVID-19 on your life as a disabled person? And what was the best response to COVID-19 in your country for disabled people and why? So I'll let people do that and Gemma will read them out and we'll take a few people's verbal comments when we get something interesting in the chat. What was the worst impact of COVID-19 on your life as a disabled person over the last year? And what was the best response to COVID-19 in your country for disabled people and why?
Richard, could you now give at least a minute of peace for people to do that?
Yeah. Okay, Gemma, do you want to start reading some of them out now.
Okay. Many of them are about people with hearing impairment. During lockdown period, some of the hearing impaired people were suffered hardships because non-availability of interpreters and insensitivity of police personnel in India. Somebody said delayed medical treatment. Somebody else said, I lost all my business capital. Psychological impact. Worst impact, communication barrier due to use of face masks, yet I lip read. Lack of access to doctors in person, given the associated limited access. Government stopped disability applications because doctors were not available to assess. Christelle said, unable to work as a performer, theatre was hardest impacted by lockdown. Theatre was first industry shut down. Psychological impact again. Delay in food and increase the price in food could afford. Then there's a positive one. Our country has given some monetary relief to the disabled people during lockdown. I think he's in India. Okay. Nicodeme said during COVID-19, he had not managed to go to the pharmacy to buy sun lotion as it was far from his home and transport was not allowed. And it impacted my well-being as my skin was very dry. Worst was the inability to work from home without the necessary assistive equipment. The best response, involvement of DPOs with the machinery of government. This ensured accessible formats of information. This is from New Zealand. The great use of New Zealand Sign Language at daily media briefings.
Right. Can we go to that, the New Zealand one, if they can tell us how they managed to get that?
Okay, Joanne, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, I think New Zealand is a bit lucky in that our DPOs have a seat at quite a few government meeting tables, and so disabled people were thought of in the beginning, but we still faced some of the same issues that people here have mentioned, for example, or that Richard touched on. For example, getting PPE gear was challenging, so people didn't have access to PPE gear. It wasn't, apparently we had enough, but it never got to where it needed to go. But at least we were informed about what COVID was, what we had to do to keep ourselves safe, and we were pretty much in the same boat as everybody else who wasn't disabled. Just a few extra challenges.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Can we go back to the person from India who talked about the police insensitivity? Was that particularly to deaf people, or what was that?
It was in relation to deaf people. Just bearing one moment. Okay, that was Marisport. He may need to sign. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
No, actually,
okay.
I am visually impaired, but I knew that information. So actually what happened, some of the hearing impaired, especially complete lockdown period, without interpreters, these people are unable to communicate their necessity to the police personnels. As a result, police personnels, whatever the sign which hearing impaired made, they consider as offensive and they treated badly. And interpreters were also not there, and it was so unfortunate during that time. So this was the issue which some of the hearing impaired people have faced during lockdown period.
I think that was also an issue in Uganda. I picked up a story there. Is anyone on the call from Uganda who can verify what happened there? If not, we come back to that if there is. Okay, let's take one or two others.
somebody saying we were forgotten completely until we started making noise that we should be carried along. That's a great one. During somebody was having a bad time in Nigeria. Grateful to my doctors for support. As a disabled teacher, I had to learn new technology to take part in the teaching process, and I think I could not teach so well, but when I teach in physical classroom. This is a key one. Being disabled, my social personal life is totally disturbed. Adverse impact on physical mobility. Somebody in Nigeria says no positive response from Nigeria government yet. Somebody has son with autism became extremely active, endangered himself, but he couldn't get the medicine. There's lots talking about sign language.
Right. The deaf community definitely, I think, was significantly impacted, but so it sounds were other groups. I mean, we had in the UK rationing, and the doctor who spoke on the film at the beginning talked about they were having to ration resources. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened with the rationing of resources, decisions were made, what they call triage. Decisions were made about who should get the treatment and who shouldn't. And it nearly always was that the disabled person went to the back of the queue. So I think some of the deaths are because of clinical judgments that we are not worth having. And we had to fight quite hard against guidance that was put out by the British medical establishment and so on to get that guidance changed. There's Rilwan Mohammed has got his hand up. Maybe he's got something to add into this.
He had his hand up for some time, actually, Richard, from the beginning, in fact.
Oh, all right. Is there anybody who wants to add into the chat now? Do they have experience of this rationing of medical resources for disabled people? Was it just something that happened in the UK? It doesn't sound like it was.
Somebody in Uganda did put their hand up just before you asked that question. I don't know if
okay, well,
Fiona, do you want to come in?
What they have to say, and then we'll need to move on, I think.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, I am Fiona from Uganda. You talked about some of the experiences that persons with disabilities experienced during the lockdown. We had a scenario of two deaf people who really their cases became outstanding. One was beaten and later on he died by the police simply because they couldn't communicate to him. Then one was also a deaf person who was shot by, he was gunned down and later on he was amputated. So those are some of the outstanding cases that persons with disabilities really faced in Uganda. It was really a lot during the lockdown. Thank you.
This was policing of the lockdown by the police, and there was a communication issue, so they used their force against these people. Is that right? That led to these, yeah. That's shocking, actually. I have mentioned that. I knew of one of them. I didn't know of both. We mentioned it on a briefing we did with the General Secretary of the Commonwealth on the 2nd of December, and people were quite shocked by that. Was anything done to the police officers who did that, or have they been let go?
Yeah, their cases are still in police up to now because one of them was the resident district commissioner of one of the districts here in Uganda. And he has been in prison. And then the national DPO of the country has been following up the case. And then with the one who was amputated because of how he was treated and he was shot down, also the case was in police.
So yeah, so some criminal act justice has been involved with the police who did it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for telling us that, Fiona. I think now we're going to need to move on, but clearly there have been real issues that have come out of this. And now we're going to go back to Sarah to tell us a bit about Article 25 and the health system. Sarah, are you online?
Yes, Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to talk about Article 25 on the right to equal access to same standards of health and services as others, and must take all appropriate measures, and SDG 3. Okay, Article 25 of the UNCRPD reinforces the right of persons with disabilities to attain the highest standard of healthcare without discrimination. However, the reality is that few countries provided the quality services for disabled people. Also, very few countries collect data to enable desegregation by disability in the health sector. Again, SDG 3 goal aiming to ensure healthy lives and promotion of well-being for all at all ages. Disabled people are an important disadvantaged and marginalized group to consider within the SDGs, as they are a large group making up an estimated 1 billion people worldwide. And they experience a range of exclusions owing to multiple forms of discrimination and inaccessible environments in many spheres of lives, including SDG 3 targets. But there are also barriers to adequate healthcare for disabled people, which include prohibitive costs, affordability of health services for persons with disabilities. Transportation are two main reasons why disabled people do not receive much needed healthcare in low-income countries. Just over half of disabled people are unable to afford healthcare, compared to about a third of non-disabled people. Another barrier is the limited availability of services. There is lack of appropriate services for disabled people, and many studies have revealed high unmet needs for healthcare among disabled people due to unavailability of services, especially in rural and remote areas. Another barrier is the physical barrier, uneven access to buildings. Those are hospitals and health centers, inaccessible medical equipment, poor signage, lack of interpretation, as we have seen from even the previous engagement just now, narrow doorways, internal steps, inadequate bathroom facilities, and inaccessible parking areas create barriers to healthcare facilities. Another barrier is inadequate skills and knowledge of health workers. Disabled people are more than twice as likely to report finding healthcare for providers skills inadequate to meet their need, 4 times more likely to report being treated badly, and nearly 3 times more likely to report being denied care. Then we have a few questions that we have for you to chat on access on health. And in our countries, how accessible was health care? Were people with disabilities able to access the services? And also the cost of the service, were health care services affordable? Because COVID-19 came with a very high cost, or were persons with disability able to afford availability? Were they available in the first place because of many reasons? And were persons with disability able to get the services availed to them? So we would like to discuss in our countries in the
Right.
chat box that we have. If this service were accessible, affordable, or available, and if not, why were they not available? Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Sarah. So this is our next activity on the chat. So I'll go over it so people are clear. We're not just talking about COVID, we're talking about generally for health. Is it accessible for all? If not, why not? Is it affordable for all? If not, why not? And is it available for all? And why not for disabled people? And we've given you some of the barriers there, but there were probably lots of other barriers that you could come up with. So we'll give you a minute to think about that. So on the chat, in your country, accessibility, affordability, availability for disabled people of healthcare, and what you think the reasons might be why we're not accessing it or not getting it. So we'll wait, give you some time to think, because that seemed to work last time. Thank you. Okay, Gemma.
We've just got a couple at the moment.
Right.
Takes
a bit more thinking about this one, I think.
Yeah, they will probably still come in as I read them, so you have to bear with me a minute. In Uganda, we have ENT services in limited hospitals, and the charges are quite high for the ordinary people, like hearing aids, costing up to 3 million, I'm guessing that's Uganda shillings per piece. So in Uganda, we have ear, nose and throat services in limited hospitals, and the charges are quite high for the ordinary people, like hearing aids, costing up to 3 million Uganda shillings. Various other people are saying is limited accessibility or hardly accessible, affordable for disabled people. Accessibility was the issue. We're thriving to get an accessible environment, especially in the public sector, such as hospitals. Government is reluctant to serve accessible facilities. Somebody in Nigeria, healthcare services were not available. Movements were stopped, and going to the hospital then was not easy. Doctors were scared of attending to people. So general transportation system in Nigeria is very poor and not inclusive for persons with disabilities. So where we were always in our homes. Okay, yes, I've heard this one. In Uganda, healthcare was not accessible during lockdown because of boda were not supposed to carry any passengers. In South Africa, only those that have access to funds can afford and access the healthcare system. For those in rural areas, hospitals are far and devices are expensive for most people. Cost is very high. Somebody else said that. Disability is placed in the charity model in most services, and when nothing is done to change this attitude, things will go slowly. Accessibility in India, accessibility to the healthcare is still an area The government will have to improve a lot. It's not accessible in Nigeria. More than one person saying that. In Mauritius, hospitals always remained open. The initial full lockdown, everything was closed, including the pharmacy, for about 5 days. Then the government started opening everything up again very slowly, and we had to follow an alphabetical order. Police were very strict. Somebody in Bangladesh, not accessible for everyone. Most of the healthcare centres have lack of physical accessibility, such as ramp or elevators. Most of the healthcare centres have no sign language interpreter. Healthcare services are afforded in government hospitals, but all types of healthcare are not available in government hospitals. Somebody else in Bangladesh had said the same thing.
Okay,
yeah.
There'll be more coming in, but can we ask people to do one more thing in the chat? Just think of one of those barriers that you've identified, and what would be the best way to change that in your country? One of the barriers that you've identified, what would be the best way that we as disabled people could change that? So let's sort of move on to being a bit more positive about how we might make the healthcare system fit more to Article 25. Remember, 182 governments have ratified this, including all but one. 50 of the Commonwealth countries, 3 have signed it, and only 1 have not touched it at all, which is Botswana. All the others have signed up to this, so they need to be doing it. How can we make them do it more?
Okay, you need to give a minute for that to be come through.
Okay, anyone written anything yet?
Yeah, just one moment. So Nigeria government should institutionalize disability issues in the health sectors, thereby making it inclusive and accessible for all. Somebody else in Uganda, policy adherence and strictness, because laws are there. However, it's just paperwork not actually adhered to. Hold on. Okay, in Uganda, at least as a medical worker, I have visited most of the hospitals. Accessibility for persons with hearing impairments is not there. Government should employ sign language interpreters, at least at referral healthcare centres. In Nigeria, capacity building for health services provider. They need to be trained on how to deal with persons with disabilities and issues that concern them. Physiotherapy should be part of the mandatory course curriculum to be independent. Oh, I see. That might be our course curriculum. Not sure. Policy should be implemented rather than including. Actions should be taken. Government should provide at least one staff for persons with disabilities in hospital. There can be a change in policies. There can be a change if policies are made and strictly adhered to. We need to find a system that can make assistive devices more affordable, if not free, and also adopt the model of free rides, Uber-like, for disabled people that is being used in Cape Town, and more training on health workers. Also including knowledge of disability in medical work training will help. Having disabled people in positions to influence change in hospitals. In India, government has launched many schemes for disabled people for better healthcare. There's an inclusive scheme. I'm not going to try and read what that says, but many are still finding it inaccessible. It differs from region to region.
Okay.
Changing cost management for treatment, which is available for disabled people. Oh, and the last one, disabled groups should be consistent in their discussion and engagement with the government. Such groups should keep involving the government in their programs. The private sector should also be involved to promote awareness around disability issues.
Yeah. All points, really good points, which we will come back to, particularly in module 13 and 14, which is how we change things. What we're really doing on this course is laying out what the issues are that we have to address to get disability equality in our lives. And, you know, the question about Nigeria should institutionalize disability in all health policies and all policies. Well, the issue is how we get to that. As I understand it, there are 27 million disabled people in Nigeria. You need to get organized. And at the moment, there's been a big split that's been stopping the organizations there working effectively for several years. That needs to be solved by us ourselves and realize that our needs are much greater than having battles between each other. So that we can have a united front to challenge government. And I'm sure that ordinary disabled people in Nigeria would want that. So we also have to make sure we have strong and powerful organizations that are democratic and represent what we want, are not there as individual power plays for certain people. They have to be democratic and they have to be accountable to us, which is our criticism of the charities that don't do that. We have to make sure our own organizations do. We need to make sure that we are taking all of these things forward. But I think it's useful to sometimes write these down. Person who said that physio should be part of this course, no, it isn't, because this is not a medical course. Availability to physio for those who need it, how we campaign and get it, absolutely. And to occupational therapy and getting the right assessments for the right devices, orthotics, chairs, and so on is vital for us, but not to train professionals on that. That's the job they have. There is a huge role in the training of those professionals for there to be expert disabled people, what we call disability equality trainers, who actually make their living by going and actually educating professionals who are undergoing training. And then the other route that someone mentioned there is more disabled people getting into healthcare jobs. Absolutely. There should be a quota. In India, there's a 4% quota, but I wonder if it applies to doctors, for instance. I think it's only certain occupations that are in that. And we have to say, no, it has to be opened up in all areas. So there are many things that we need to do, and we've just been touching the surface there, but I think it's been a useful interaction. Now we're going to go on now to Article 12. And first of all, Michael Njenga is
impact on
I'm introducing
in your life. I think you don't have this.
I think Article 12 impacts on all your decisions, and this could be small decision like what to wear, where to go, the kind of friends you want to have. And it could be about big decision also, about owning land, owning property. It could be about the enjoyment of a whole array of human rights. For example, the right to vote. More than often, you will find in laws stating that persons of unsound mind cannot vote or they cannot stand for elective office. So I think for me, it sort of affects small and big decisions, and also across the board, affects the enjoyment of all other fundamental rights and freedoms.
So that was an introduction to Article 12. Most people take it for granted that they can make decisions and have the respect, then their decisions respected by others. Legal capacity is the ability to hold rights and duties and the ability to exercise those rights and duties. It's about both big and small decisions, as we heard from Michael, and is a prerequisite to enjoying all human rights. Historically, many groups have been denied the right to legal capacity, been locked away, had invasive treatments done to them, which they were not party to agreeing. Persons with disabilities remain a group whose legal capacity is being denied globally. Persons with psychosocial and intellectual disability are disproportionately affected in the denial of this legal capacity, which is why we look to people with from the neurodiverse community, the learning difficulty community, and those with mental health issues to tell us about this. So some more from Michael now on this.
Supporters? So there are two ways which we are addressing this. So I think the first thing we've been doing is raising a lot of awareness around Article 12. Secondly is, doctors, most of them they're not trained in human rights. They're not aware about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we have to engage with them and make them understand about the paradigm shift. Then the other tool that we use is to work with peer support groups. So for example, I go to a peer support group, and if I was to get into distress, the members know what I like and what I do not like. So even when I'm in hospital, they're able to say, no, but this person does not like this kind of medication. So there are practical things that we are doing in the country towards the realization of this particular right. The other thing is that we are advocating, of course, for advanced directives to be put into the law, so that it's not a question of, people who are acting out of goodwill or charity, but they are obligated to follow the provision, for example, of the mental health care bill, which we want to enact into a new mental health law.
Okay, so
supporters?
No. So how is legal capacity denied? Well, full or partial guardianship, which is the norm around the world, is one of the main ways that legal capacity is denied. People might say, oh, what do you expect? The family should do that. But as we'll hear from Michael, very often the family are acting in their own interests and not that of the person they're meant to represent. And so Article 12 is very clear about not having guardianship. Mental health laws allow involuntary admissions to hospitals and institutions, forced treatment and deprivation of liberty, sectioning, often called in this country, on the base or certification on the basis of disability or impairment. Informal guardianship, this is an informal regime of substitute decision-making, i.e. where the family member makes the decision on behalf of the person. That is not okay. It is denying legal capacity to the disabled person. So let's hear what Michael says on that.
Our old idea of denying legal capacity to people came very much from a medical or biomedical model of the person, seeing the problem in the person, and that there were certain people who were not allowed to do things. What's your reaction as someone with mental health issues to that whole view?
I think for me, we must really distinguish what we call mental capacity. And mental capacity is the decision-making capability, and this varies from one person to another vis-a-vis legal capacity, which is the right to make your own decision and to have those decisions respected by others. And I think the assumption here is always that when you have a mental impairment, then you're going to make wrong decision. And the fact of the matter is that we cannot afford to know the inner workings of a person's mind. There's no objective way of determining that. So that notion from the medical model, of course, is outdated. And this is something which was, borrowed from the British common law system. And just to illustrate, for example, in election processes, for example, in Kenya, in 2007, people who the law says are of unsound mind did not vote. But everyone else who, quote unquote, was of sound mind voted. And then after that, we had post-election violence. So, I mean, the whole discussion about, people being of unsound and sound mind, there's no objective determination of that, because in Kenya, the people who are sound voted, and then they almost brought the country to war. The people who are not unsound, they did not vote. So I think for me, it's just about, there's no objective way of determining the way a person make their own decision, and we should allow people to make mistakes. We should give them the dignity of risk in decision making.
That's very clear. Okay, so then we go on to the paradigm shift, and let's have a look at that. All persons with disabilities are presumed to have legal capacity, and states must take all appropriate measures to ensure this is realized. Prohibits all involuntary practices, involuntary admissions, embraces a supported decision-making paradigm, and it recognizes will and preference to be the underlying principles in all decision-making processes. So not mental capacity, but the right to make, have your will expressed and make a preference. To provide for safeguards against abuse and undue influence, particularly by guardians. And recognize the right of persons with disabilities to own property and access all financial services on an equal basis with others. Often not allowed to have bank accounts or to own property in their own right. A position that in many societies was the position that women were in until quite recently. In fact, all women were seen as biologically inferior to men, something that's been disproved now, absolutely. But laws were based on it. So if you want to see how wrong this law is to people with mental health issues, you only need to look at previous laws which use the same wrong thinking about women. Distinguishes between mental capacity and legal capacity. And this is really quite important. So let's go on and see what else we can learn about this.
I think still it's a very problematic position, because most countries in terms of their legislation, they have not adopted the paradigm shift, because everyone, as you said rightly, is presumed to have legal capacity irrespective of whether they have a mental health condition. So then the thing is, people are still experiencing things like involuntary admission, So for example, in Africa, it is very common when you have a mental health condition and you're in crisis or in distress, then your family members will tie you up and they will take you to hospital against your will. Or they will call the police, and the police will come and tie you up and take you to hospital by force. So I think there's a whole issue of the kind of practices. So it is not just about the law, it's also about the practice that denies persons with mental health condition their right to make decisions and to have those decisions respected, by others. We've had issues of
So I'm going to cut this a bit short as we're running out of time, but supported decision-making ensures information is provided in an accessible way. There's an evaluation of all available alternatives. Support is provided to implement decision. So for instance, appropriate safeguards are provided, peer support, which Michael already mentioned, advanced directives, which he's talked about, circles of friends, which is a support group that does what the person at the center of the circle wants. And the people in the circle are people that that person wants there. Support agreements, family support, once the family have been educated on these rights, and social capital, social workers. I'm going to click on through this and to just end up with really what happens in difficult situations. It's not practical to determine the preference of an individual. The best interpretations will be, and preferences must replace the best interest. So best interests go, which lots of professionals think they know what's best. And instead, the best interpretations of the will and preference of the person, that's where the advanced directives comes in. That's where the peer support comes in. People who trust and the person trusts. They say, no, they want this. They don't want to be, they don't want electric convulsive therapy. They don't want that particular drug. They've made that clear. Here, they've written it down. So you can't just say, no, well, I think this is in the best interest. You can't do that under Article 12. So to show the problems with this, when we were making the convention, the International Disability Caucus was having a lot of problems getting people to understand this change in thinking that was necessary. So we put this leaflet into the UN Ad Hoc Committee in January 2006, and I was part of that, and we put this in. Would you want this to happen to you? Wouldn't you have the feeling that you had lost your dignity and want it back when you were stopped from doing the things it says at the top there? Would you feel like this? And I think that's really worth looking at, and it's in the course book, so you can have a look at it. And I'm afraid we took too long on the other questions, so we're going to go on to the last thing now. But you could do those questions yourselves. Now let's hear from
the COVID-19 crisis is affecting every aspect of our societies, revealing the extent of exclusion that the most marginalized members of society experience. Today, I would like to highlight how the pandemic is affecting the world's 1 billion people with disabilities. Even under normal circumstances, persons with disabilities are less likely to access education, health care and income opportunities, or participate in the community. This is exacerbated for those in humanitarian and fragile contexts. People with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty, and they experience higher rates of violence, neglect, and abuse. The pandemic is intensifying these inequalities and producing new threats. Today, we are launching a report that recommends a disability-inclusive response and recovery for everyone. People with disabilities are among the hardest hit by COVID-19. They face a lack of accessible public health information, significant barriers to implement basic hygiene measures, and inaccessible health facilities. If they contract COVID-19, many are more likely to develop severe health conditions which may result in death. The share of COVID-19 related deaths in care homes, where older people with disabilities are overrepresented, ranges from 19% to an astonishing 72%. In some countries, healthcare rationing decisions are based on discriminatory criteria such as age or assumptions about quality or value of life based on disability. We cannot let this continue. We must guarantee the equal rights of people with disabilities to access healthcare and life-saving procedures during the pandemic. Persons with disabilities who faced exclusion in employment before this crisis are now more likely to lose their job and will experience greater difficulties in returning to work. Yet only 28% of people with significant disabilities have access to benefits, and only 1% in low-income countries. People with disabilities, particularly women and girls, face a greater risk of domestic violence, which has surged during the pandemic. I urge governments to place people with disabilities at the center of COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, and to consult and engage with people with disabilities. Persons with disabilities have valuable experience to offer of thriving in situations of isolation and alternate working arrangements. Looking to the future, we have a unique opportunity to design and implement more inclusive and accessible societies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, I launched the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy to ensure the UN system is doing its part. The strategy represents the UN's commitment to achieve transformative and lasting change. When we secure the rights of people with disabilities, we are investing in our common future.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask Sarah if she'd like to say a few words to sum up. I've got a few things to say at the end then. So Sarah, are you online?
Yes, Richard, I'm here.
Okay, would you like to give us some comments to finish up?
Yeah, I would just like to say that health is very key in relation to our well-being, and therefore governments need to take up health seriously and ensure that they put special measures to make sure that persons with disabilities are included in the response to emergencies, to medical care, and even to health as a whole, such that they don't feel like they are not thought about as governments are giving services to everyone else in their countries. And therefore, I want to urge DPOs and activists, advocates, to go out there in their numbers so that they can make their governments force or talk to them and make them bring those services on board where they are not, and make them better where they are not accessible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I apologize for us getting the timing slightly wrong on that. You can do the questions that when the PowerPoint is up on the website, you'll be able to do those three on Article 12, which I think would be useful for you to think about. You will have all been written to. There is now a system of sending your work in, so you don't have to hang on to it right until the end. We would be quite pleased to see those who are putting in work for accreditation, to see the volume of it. We're not going to look at it really till the first 7 modules are over, but we would be happy to receive it into the email addresses that you've been told to send it to, so please do that. I think that to end, I'd say that the message from Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the United Nations, a very powerful person in the world, that message that he gave in that film is a very powerful message, and it means that the United Nations agencies in every one of our countries is now an ally in our struggle to get our human rights, to get the Sustainable Development Goals, which says leave no one behind. So that's a powerful argument, and to help us implement our rights under the UN Convention and to build our capacity as civil society organizations. So this is really a course. It's not an academic course. It's a course to build up people's understanding of the issues we face and how to deal with them. And so in doing the follow-up work, please bear that in mind. This is about equipping you to be able to build and lead your colleagues in your DPOs to actually put pressure on government. And while we will wait to module 13 and 14 to look at that in more detail, throughout the course, there are questions on how you build campaigns and how you do that. And so when you're doing the work on this module and subsequent modules, bear that in mind. But I hope people have found it useful. We tried to slow things down a bit. Perhaps we slowed them down too much because it didn't quite work in terms of the balance, for which is my fault. I apologize. We'll try and get it better from here on in. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your help. And thanks to the signers and the captioners, and to Gemma for reading everything out, and to Sarah for helping me present this. So thank you very much. You can put your screen on for a minute if you like to wave goodbye to everybody. That would be fine now. So bye. Thank you very much. Been good to have you all on board, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.